The cleaning rod moved with mechanical precision through the barrel of the M24 sniper rifle, each stroke deliberate and practiced. Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez had performed this ritual thousands of times, but tonight something felt different. The fluorescent lights of the armory cast harsh shadows across her weathered hands as she worked, the familiar weight of the weapon steady on the metal table before her. The scent of gun oil and metal cleaner filled her nostrils, mixing with the perpetual dampness that seemed to permeate every building on Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. You're here late again, Vasquez. The voice belonged to Corporal Marcus Chun, her spotter, and closest friend in this godforsaken corner of Afghanistan. He emerged from behind a row of weapon lockers, his own rifle slung over his shoulder, fatigue etched deep in the lines around his eyes. Third night this week, Elena didn't look up from her work. Can't sleep. Might as well make sure she's ready for tomorrow's patrol. She patted the stock of her rifle with an almost maternal affection. Besides, you know how the colonel gets when equipment isn't maintained to his standards. Marcus set his weapon down and pulled up a metal stool beside her. At 24, he was 3 years younger than Elena, but the war had aged them both beyond their years. His Asian features bore the permanent squint of someone who spent too many hours peering through scopes, searching for threats in the endless brown landscape of the Hindu Kush Mountains. Speaking of Colonel Hartwick, did you hear about what happened to Specialist Morrison? The cleaning rod paused mid-stroke. Morrison was barely 19, fresh out of basic training, with freckles that made him look even younger than he was. Elena had taken him under her wing during his first week on base, teaching him how to properly maintain his equipment and recognize the signs of an incoming mortar attack. "What about Morrison?" he filed a complaint. Said the colonel made inappropriate comments during the equipment inspection yesterday. Something about how Morrison's rifle wasn't the only thing that needed proper handling. Marcus's voice carried a bitter edge. Guess what happened to that complaint? Elena finally looked up, her dark eyes meeting Marcus's gaze. She already knew the answer, but she needed to hear it confirmed. Disappeared, like it never existed. Morrison got reassigned to night watch duty for the next month. Apparently, he needs time to reflect on proper military protocol and respect for superior officers. Marcus shook his head, his jaw clenched. That's the third complaint this month, Elena. Third one that just vanished into thin air. The armory fell silent except for the distant hum of generators and the occasional pop of cooling metal. Elena resumed her cleaning, but her movements had lost their earlier precision. Her mind wandered to the other incidents Marcus was referencing. There was Sergeant Williams, a tough-as-nails mechanic from Detroit, who had complained about the colonel's hands-on inspection techniques. Then Private First Class Santos, a quiet kid from New Mexico who had reported uncomfortable questions about his personal life. During what should have been routine performance reviews, Elena had her own memories of Colonel Hartwick's behavior. Moments that lived in the shadowy spaces between appropriate and inappropriate, professional and personal. The way his eyes lingered too long during briefings. The unnecessary physical contact disguised as military protocol. The comments that could be interpreted as either mentorship or something far more sinister, depending on your willingness to give him the benefit of the doubt. You know what really gets me? Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. We're over here fighting for freedom, for justice, for all these noble ideals they talked about back in training. But what kind of justice is it when the people supposed to protect us are the ones we need protection from? Elena set down her cleaning rod and picked up a soft cloth, beginning to wipe down the rifle's exterior. The weapon was a thing of beauty in its deadly simplicity, a Remington 700 action bedded in a fiberglass stock, topped with a Leupold scope that could resolve a human face at 800 meters. She had used this particular rifle to eliminate 17 confirmed targets over her 3 tours of duty, each shot fired in defense of her fellow soldiers, or innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of a war they never asked for. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the old country, Elena said, her voice carrying the faint accent that emerged whenever she was tired or emotional. Mexico, before she came north to work the fields in California. She said there were men in her village, men with power, who thought their authority extended beyond the law. She called them pequeños dictadores, little dictators. Said they were the most dangerous kind, because people expected them to protect, not prey. Marcus nodded, understanding the parallel. What happened to those men? Eventually, the people stopped being afraid. When enough voices spoke up together, even the little dictators couldn't silence them all. Elena held up her rifle, checking the barrel's alignment in the harsh fluorescent light. But it took time, and it took courage. The armory door creaked open, and both soldiers instinctively straightened their postures. But it was only Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, no relation to the PFC who had filed the disappeared complaint. Maria was a medic, originally from Puerto Rico, with kind eyes and steady hands that had saved more lives than anyone could count. She carried her own burden of authority, responsible for the physical and mental well-being of everyone on base, from the low-list private to the commanding officers. "Evening, you two," Maria said, setting down her medical bag and rubbing her temples. "Elena, I was hoping I'd find you here. We need to talk." Something in Maria's tone made Elena's stomach clench. The medic's usual warm demeanor was replaced by professional concern, mixed with barely contained anger. "What's wrong?" "I had to treat 3 soldiers today. 3 separate incidents, all reporting stress-related symptoms. Insomnia, anxiety attacks, loss of appetite." When I pressed for details about potential triggers, Maria paused, choosing her words carefully. "Let's just say they all mentioned the same superior officer's name." Elena and Marcus exchanged glances. They all knew the military's official protocols for reporting sexual harassment and abuse of power. They also knew how rarely those protocols resulted in meaningful action, especially when the accused held significant rank and political connections back home. Colonel Hartwick wasn't just any officer. He was a decorated veteran with 3 Bronze Stars and a recommendation for promotion to Brigadier General pending his successful completion of this deployment. "Maria, you know I respect you, but we can't just make accusations based on," Elena began. "I'm not making accusations," Maria interrupted, her voice sharp with frustration. "I'm documenting patterns. As the senior medic on this base, it's my responsibility to identify threats to soldier welfare, whether they come from enemy fire or from within our own ranks." She opened her medical bag and pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting. Private Johnson reported panic attacks that started 3 weeks ago, right after a one-on-one performance review with the colonel. Corporal Yu developed chronic insomnia following a disciplinary meeting where the colonel allegedly made comments about Liu's family back home. And Specialist Torres came to see me today with stress-induced stomach problems that began after the colonel helped him with weapons maintenance last week. The notebook represented something dangerous, documented evidence of a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. In the wrong hands, it could destroy careers, including Maria's. In the right hands, it might finally provide the accountability that had been lacking for too long. "What are you planning to do with that information?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Honestly, I don't know yet." Maria closed the notebook and tucked it back into her bag. "I've been going through official channels for months. Every report I file gets buried under bureaucratic procedures or dismissed as combat stress manifestations. Meanwhile, good soldiers are suffering and morale is dropping faster than I can treat the symptoms." Elena finished reassembling her rifle and locked it into position. The weapon was now pristine, every component cleaned and lubricated, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. She wished the moral complexities of military life could be maintained with the same straightforward efficiency. "There's something else," Maria continued, her voice dropping even lower. "I heard through back channels that Specialist Morrison isn't just getting night watch duty. He's being transferred to a forward observation post in Helmand Province, most dangerous sector in our operational area, minimal support, high casualty rates." The implication hung heavy in the air. Helmand Province was where careers went to die, sometimes literally. It was the military equivalent of exile, reserved for soldiers who had fallen from favor or posed inconvenient problems for their superiors. Sending Morrison there wasn't just punishment. It was potentially a death sentence. "When?" Elena asked. "Transport leaves tomorrow at 0800 hours. Elena stood up and began packing away her cleaning supplies with methodical precision. Each tool had its place, every component secured and accounted for. Order imposed on chaos, just like she had been trained to do since her first day in basic training 12 years ago. But tonight, the familiar routine felt hollow, like going through the motions of normalcy while the foundation of everything she believed in crumbled beneath her feet. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "All of this, we all do. Marcus." And Maria nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. They were approaching a line that, once crossed, would change everything. Speaking out against a superior officer, especially one with Colonel Hartwick's connections and reputation, was career suicide at best, potential treason charges at worst. But remaining silent while soldiers under their protection suffered was its own form of betrayal. As they prepared to leave the armory, Elena took one last look around the room. Row upon row of weapons stood at attention in their locked cases, tools of war maintained in perfect condition, ready to defend their users against external threats. But who, she wondered, would defend them against the threats that wore the same uniform and carried the same flag? The question followed her into the Afghan night, where the stars burned cold and distant above a war that had already lasted too long and cost too much. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and potentially new choices that would define not just her own future, but the futures of every soldier who looked to her for guidance and protection. In 12 hours, her world would change forever. But for now, Elena Vasquez walked back to her barracks with her rifle secured and her conscience troubled, unaware that Colonel Hartwick was watching from his office window, already planning his next move in a game she didn't even know she was playing. Elena's bunk was positioned strategically in the corner of the women's barracks, with clear sight lines to both entrances and a wall at her back. Old habits from a childhood spent navigating the dangerous streets of East Los Angeles, where situational awareness meant the difference between getting home safely and not getting home at all. She lay on the thin military issue mattress, still fully clothed, despite the late hour, staring at the corrugated metal ceiling while her mind replayed the evening's conversation with Marcus and Maria. Sleep had become elusive over the past few months, replaced by a hypervigilance that extended far beyond her designated duty hours. Every creak of the building, every footstep in the corridor, every voice raised in the distance triggered her combat instincts. But this wasn't the familiar alertness of being in enemy territory. This was something worse. This was the paranoia that came from not knowing who to trust within your own ranks. She turned onto her side and pulled out a worn photograph from her breast pocket. The image showed a young Latina woman in graduation cap and gown, flanked by an older couple whose faces radiated pride and hope. Elena's parents, Miguel and Carmen Vasquez, had sacrificed everything to ensure their daughter could attend college, the first in their family to do so. Miguel worked double shifts at the auto plant while Carmen cleaned office buildings downtown, both of them dreaming of a future where their daughter wouldn't have to break her back for minimum wage. Elena had been 3 credits away from her bachelor's degree in criminal justice when the towers fell. Like so many young Americans in the aftermath of 9/11s, she felt called to serve, to be part of something larger than herself. She enlisted the next week, telling her parents it would only be for 4 years, just long enough to serve her country, and earn money for graduate school through the GI Bill. That was 12 years ago. 12 years of deployments, firefights, and moral compromises that her professors had never prepared her for in their sterile classrooms. 12 years of learning that the line between hero and victim wasn't nearly as clear as the recruitment posters suggested. The photograph trembled slightly in her hands, and Elena realized she was crying. Not the dramatic tears of movies or novels, but the quiet, exhausted weeping of someone who had seen too much and carried too much for too long. Her parents called every week, their voices bright with vicarious pride as they told neighbors and co-workers about their daughter, the war hero. They didn't know about the nights like this, when the weight of her moral choices pressed down like a physical burden. "Elena, you okay over there?" The whisper came from Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, whose bunk was positioned near the center of the Coppell barracks. Walsh was a helicopter mechanic from Montana, all sharp angles and prairie toughness, but she had a protective instinct toward the other women that reminded Elena of her own grandmother. "Just thinking," Elena replied softly, tucking the photograph away. "About Morrison?" The fact that Walsh knew about Morrison's situation didn't surprise Elena. Military bases were small communities where secrets traveled faster than official communications. What surprised her was the pain in Walsh's voice, as if Morrison's fate was personal, rather than just another example of military bureaucracy. "Among other things," Elena admitted. Walsh sat up in her bunk, the springs creaking softly. "Can I tell you something, off the record?" Elena nodded, though she wasn't sure Walsh could see the gesture in the darkness. "Last month, during the maintenance inspection, Colonel Hartwick asked me to show him some specific procedures for hydraulic systems. Normal request, right? Except he kept finding reasons to stand behind me, to guide my hands through the motions. Said he wanted to make sure I had the proper technique." Walsh's voice carried a bitter edge. "At first, I thought maybe I was overreacting. You know how it is. You don't want to be the woman who can't handle a little friendly instruction from a superior officer." Elena's stomach clenched. She knew exactly how it was, the constant second-guessing, the fear of being labeled as oversensitive or unable to handle military culture. Women in combat roles walked a tightrope between being tough enough to earn respect and feminine enough to avoid threatening their male colleagues' sense of identity. But then he started asking personal questions about my love life back home, whether I got lonely on deployment, whether I ever thought about what it would be like to be with someone who really understood the military lifestyle. Walsh paused, and Elena could hear her taking steady breaths, regaining control. "He never crossed any obvious lines, Elena. Never touched me inappropriately or made explicit propositions. But the whole thing felt predatory, like he was testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before I pushed back." "Did you report it? To who?" "Major Peterson, who plays poker with Hartwick every Friday night. Captain Rodriguez, who owes his current assignment to Hartwick's recommendation. The chaplain, who's been counseling Hartwick through his divorce proceedings." Walsh's laugh was devoid of humor. "Face it, Elena. The system protects itself, and right now, Hartwick is the system." Elena closed her eyes and tried to imagine what her criminal justice professors would have made of this situation. They had spent countless hours discussing institutional corruption, the blue wall of silence that protected bad cops, the way power structures could insulate wrongdoers from consequences. But those had been theoretical discussions, case studies from textbooks, problems for other people to solve. Now she was living inside one of those case studies, and the theoretical solution seemed inadequate for the messy reality of military hierarchy and career survival. "There's something else you should know," Walsh continued. I've been keeping my own informal records. Nothing official. Just observations. Patterns. I think Hartwick has been systematically targeting soldiers who fit a specific profile. What kind of profile? Young, isolated, career-focused. People who are far from home, who don't have strong support networks, who are ambitious enough to be vulnerable to his influence. People who have something to lose if they make waves. Walsh paused. People like Morrison, like Lou, like Torres. Elena thought about the soldiers Maria had mentioned in her medical notebook. All of them fit Walsh's description. Dedicated. Troops who had worked hard to earn their positions, who couldn't afford to be labeled as troublemakers or malcontents. They were exactly the kind of victims a predator would choose. People whose credibility could be questioned, whose motivations could be impugned, whose careers could be destroyed with a few well-placed words in the right personnel files. What? About the others, the women? Elena asked. Same pattern, mostly. But with us, he's more careful, more subtle. He knows that sexual harassment charges against female soldiers get more attention, more scrutiny. So he focuses on psychological manipulation, professional intimidation, creating environments where we feel isolated and vulnerable without ever doing anything that would leave obvious evidence. Elena sat up in her own bunk, no longer even pretending to try to sleep. The conversation was dragging her toward conclusions she wasn't ready to face, implications that would require action rather than passive observation. Walsh, what you're describing. It sounds like you think this is organized, systematic. I think Hartwick is a predator who has learned to game the system. I think he uses his position, his reputation, and his knowledge of military culture to identify and exploit vulnerable soldiers. And I think he's been doing it for years, probably across multiple assignments, leaving a trail of damaged people in his wake. The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. If Walsh was right, then Colonel Hartwick wasn't. Just a bad officer who had crossed some lines. He was a serial predator who had weaponized the military chain of command to protect himself while hunting his subordinates. Elena's mind flashed back to her conversation with Marcus earlier that evening, his bitter words about fighting for justice while being denied justice. She thought about Maria's notebook, filled with the documented suffering of soldiers who had nowhere else to turn. She thought about Morrison, barely 19 years old, being sent to a combat zone as punishment for speaking the truth. What do you think we should do? Elena asked. Honestly, I don't know. I've spent weeks trying to figure out a way to expose him that wouldn't end with all of us getting court-martialed or transferred to dead-end assignments. The military doesn't reward whistleblowers, Elena. It destroys them. Elena knew Walsh was right. Military culture valued loyalty above almost everything else, and that loyalty was expected to flow upward through the chain of command without question or hesitation. Soldiers who challenged their superiors, even for legitimate reasons, were often branded as disloyal, unreliable, or psychologically unstable. But there was another value that military culture was supposed to embody: protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, looking out for your battle buddies, ensuring that no soldier was left behind, whether on the battlefield or in the barracks. Maybe, Elena said slowly, the problem isn't that we don't know what to do. Maybe the problem is that we're trying to solve it within a system that's designed to prevent it from being solved. Walsh was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of cautious hope. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm just thinking out loud. Elena swung her legs over the side of her bunk and stood up. But maybe it's time to stop playing by rules that were written to protect people like Hartwick. She moved quietly through the barracks, stepping carefully around the other sleeping soldiers, and made her way to the small window that looked out over the base. The Hindu Kush Mountains rose like black teeth against the star-filled sky, beautiful and hostile in equal measure. Somewhere beyond those peaks was a world that seemed increasingly distant from the moral complexities of military life. Elena had joined the army to serve something greater than herself, to be part of an institution that stood for justice and protection of the innocent. But 12 years of service had taught her that institutions were only as good as the people who comprised them, and people were flawed, complicated, and capable of both great heroism and terrible betrayal. Tomorrow, she would have to decide who she wanted to be. A soldier who followed orders and maintained the status quo, even when that status quo protected predators and punished victims. Or a human being who risked everything to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. As she stood at the window, watching the distant mountains and thinking about Morrison's transport to Helmand Province, Elena began to feel something she hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. Not about the consequences of action, which remained terrifyingly uncertain, but about the moral necessity of taking a stand. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Eventually, the people stopped being afraid. Maybe it was time to stop being afraid. The next morning brought the familiar rhythm of military routine. Reveille at 0545, formation at 0600, breakfast at 0630. Elena moved through the morning's rituals with mechanical precision, but her mind was elsewhere, processing the previous night's conversations and their implications. She watched Morrison load his gear onto the transport truck, his young face stoic despite the obvious injustice of his reassignment. Other soldiers offered quiet words of encouragement or avoided eye contact entirely, depending on their own appetite for potential involvement. Colonel Hartwick supervised the departure from his command post, his bearing erect and professional as always. At 48, he cut an impressive figure in his pressed uniform, his graying temples lending him an air of distinguished authority that had served him well throughout his career. Elena observed him with new eyes, looking for signs of the predatory behavior Walsh had described, but finding only the composed demeanor of a career officer performing his duties. That was what made him dangerous, she realized. His ability to maintain the facade of propriety, while systematically destroying the soldiers under his command. Sergeant Vasquez, Hartwick called out as the transport prepared to depart. A word. Elena's blood chilled, but she maintained her composure as she approached the colonel's position. Yes, sir. I understand you've been spending considerable time in the armory after hours. Admirable dedication to equipment maintenance, but I want to make sure you're getting adequate rest. Combat effectiveness depends on proper sleep hygiene. His tone was paternal, concerned, exactly what any reasonable observer would expect from a caring commanding officer, but Elena heard the underlying message. I know what you're doing, and I'm watching you. I appreciate your concern, sir. I'll make sure to get proper rest. She kept her voice neutral, professional. Good. I'd hate to see a soldier of your caliber suffer from preventable performance issues. Hartwick stepped closer, ostensibly to coma. Lower his voice for privacy, but the proximity felt invasive. You know, Elena. May I call you Elena? I've been reviewing your service record. Quite impressive. 3 tours, 17 confirmed kills, commendations for valor and marksmanship. The kind of record that opens doors to advancement opportunities. Elena's stomach clenched at the sound of her first name in his mouth, the casual intimacy that violated proper military protocol. Thank you, sir. I serve at the pleasure of my country and my commanding officers. Spoken like a true professional. That's exactly the kind of attitude that catches the attention of promotion boards. Hartwick's smile was warm, avuncular. In fact, I've been considering recommending you for the advanced marksmanship instructor position at Quantico. Prestigious assignment, excellent for career development, opportunity to shape the next generation of military snipers. The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implication. Quantico was a career maker, exactly the kind of assignment that could set Elena up for advancement to senior NCO positions and eventual commissioning as an officer. It was also a clear message about the benefits of maintaining good relationships with superior officers who had the power to make or break careers. That's very generous, sir. I appreciate your confidence in my abilities. Of course, such recommendations require careful consideration. Character assessment, evaluation of judgment, and reliability, review of any ... complications ... In a soldier's record. His eyes locked onto hers, and Elena saw something cold and calculating behind the facade of mentorship. I trust there won't be any complications, Elena. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Play ball. Keep quiet about whatever you think. And reap the rewards of cooperation. Rock the boat, and watch your career sink along with your credibility. I understand completely, sir, Elena replied, matching his professional tone while mentally cataloging every word for future reference. Excellent. I'm glad we understand each other. Hartwick stepped back, restoring proper distance between them. Carry on, Sergeant. Elena saluted and turned to leave, but Hartwick's voice stopped her after 2 steps. Oh, and Elena, I noticed you've been spending time with Sergeant Walsh and that medic, Santos, is it? Fine soldiers, both of them. But sometimes good people can get caught up in gossip and speculation that doesn't serve anyone's interests. I'd hate to see professional relationships damaged by misunderstandings. The message was crystal clear. I know who you've been talking to, and I'm watching them too. Elena nodded curtly and walked away, her mind racing. Hartwick wasn't just a predator, he was a skilled manipulator who had learned to weaponize the military's own systems of advancement and punishment. The promotion opportunity was bait, designed to test her loyalty and buy her silence. The implied threats against Walsh and Maria were meant to isolate potential allies and demonstrate his reach within the base's social and professional networks. She found Marcus at the communications center, monitoring radio traffic from patrol units, operating in the surrounding valleys. The work required intense concentration, listening for coded phrases that might indicate enemy activity or requests for support. But Marcus looked up when Elena entered. How'd the send-off go? He asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Morrison's gone. Hartwick made sure to personally oversee his departure. Elena pulled up a chair beside Marcus's station, positioning herself so they could speak quietly without being overheard by other personnel. He also made sure to have a little chat with me about career opportunities and the importance of maintaining good judgment. Marcus's jaw tightened. He's getting bolder. Usually, he's more subtle about the intimidation tactics. Maybe he's feeling pressure. Maria's notebook, Walsh's observations, the fact that multiple soldiers are starting to connect the dots. It's possible he's realized that his usual methods aren't containing the situation. A burst of static from the radio interrupted their conversation, followed by a tense voice requesting immediate medical evacuation for a wounded soldier. Marcus immediately shifted into professional mode, coordinating with medical personnel and air support to arrange the evacuation, but Elena could see the stress in his posture, the way his shoulders carried the weight of responsibility for lives hanging in the balance. When the radio fell quiet again, Marcus turned back to Elena with haunted eyes. You know what the worst part is? We're out here risking our lives every day, watching our friends get wounded or killed by people who hate everything we represent. And meanwhile, we've got someone in our own command structure who's destroying soldiers from the inside. It's like fighting a war on 2 fronts, except one of them is invisible. Elena understood exactly what he meant. Combat was straightforward. Identify the enemy, engage the threat, protect your fellow soldiers. But institutional predation was insidious, hidden behind legitimate authority and protected by systems designed to maintain order and hierarchy. Fighting it required different weapons and different tactics, and the potential for collateral damage to innocent people was enormous. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Elena kept her voice low, aware that their conversation could be overheard or monitored. If we had concrete evidence of Hartwick's behavior, documented, proof that couldn't be dismissed or buried, would you be willing to risk your career to see justice done? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming nervously against his equipment console. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful consideration. My little sister is starting college next year. Pre-med program at UCLA. My military benefits are covering her tuition, and my parents are counting on me to provide stability for the family while they deal with my dad's medical bills. He paused, staring at the radio equipment as if it might provide answers to impossible questions. But I keep thinking about Morrison, about all the others we don't even know about. What happens when we rotate home and leave the next group of soldiers to deal with Hartwick's bullshit? How many more kids like Morrison are going to get chewed up by this system? Elena felt a surge of respect for Marcus's honesty about his personal stakes in the situation. Military service wasn't just a job for most enlisted soldiers. It was a lifeline for families struggling with economic uncertainty, a path to education and career opportunities that might otherwise be unavailable. Risking that security for abstract principles was easy to advocate in theory, much harder to embrace when your family's future was on the line. I don't know what the right answer is, Marcus continued, but I know what the wrong answer is. The wrong answer is doing nothing while good people get destroyed by someone who's supposed to be protecting them. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Rodriguez, the base's executive officer and Hartwick's second-in-command. Rodriguez was a career officer from Texas, competent and generally well-regarded, but Elena had always sensed an uncomfortable deference in his interactions with the colonel. Sergeant Vasquez, Colonel Hartwick would like to see you in his office at 1400 hours. Something about reviewing your marksmanship training records for the Quantico recommendation. Rodriguez's tone was neutral, but Elena caught a flicker of something in his expression. Concern? Warning? She couldn't be sure. Of course, sir. I'll be there. Rodriguez nodded and turned to leave, but Elena's voice stopped him. Sir, may I ask a question? Certainly. In your experience, what qualities does the colonel value most in soldiers under his command? The question was carefully neutral, but Elena watched Rodriguez's face for any telltale signs of discomfort or evasion. She wasn't disappointed. The captain's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, and he took a moment too long to formulate his response. Colonel Hartwick is a professional who expects high standards of performance and conduct from all personnel. Loyalty, competence, discretion, the usual military virtues. His answer was technically accurate but felt rehearsed, as if he'd given similar responses before. And soldiers who demonstrate those qualities can expect fair treatment and advancement opportunities. Of course. But Rodriguez's eyes didn't quite meet hers when he said it. After he left, Marcus let out a long breath. Rodriguez knows something. I've never seen him that uncomfortable during a routine conversation. Elena nodded, filing away the interaction for future analysis. The question is whether he knows because he's complicit or because he's another victim of Hartwick's manipulation. Either way, it means we can't count on support from the chain of command. If Rodriguez is dirty, he'll warn Hartwick about any moves we make. If he's clean but intimidated, he won't stick his neck out to help us. Elena checked her watch. 0930 hours. She had 4.5 hours before her meeting with Hartwick. 4.5 hours to decide how to handle what was shaping up to be a critical confrontation. The colonel's invitation was ostensibly about the Quantico recommendation, but Elena was certain it was really about testing her compliance and reinforcing his control over the situation. I need to find Walsh and Maria, she said. If Hartwick is escalating his intimidation tactics, we need to coordinate our response. Marcus nodded, then caught her arm as she stood to leave. Elena, be careful. If Hartwick is feeling cornered, there's no telling how far he'll go to protect himself. Men with that much to lose can be dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with rank or authority. Elena squeezed his shoulder in acknowledgement, then made her way across the base toward the motor pool where Walsh would be conducting her daily maintenance routines. The morning sun was already intense, promising another scorching day in the Afghan desert, but Elena barely noticed the heat. Her mind was focused entirely on the approaching confrontation and the choices that would define not just her own future, but potentially the futures of every soldier who had suffered under Hartwick's predatory behavior. As she walked, Elena found herself mentally reviewing her training in close-quarters combat, weapons retention, and defensive tactics. She hoped such skills wouldn't be necessary in a meeting with her commanding officer, but 12 years of military service had taught her to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. What she didn't know was that Colonel Hartwick was making his own preparations, and that their 1,400 hours meeting would test far more than her marksmanship qualifications. Elena spent the morning hours before her meeting conducting what she privately called intelligence gathering. She visited the medical bay under the pretense of routine health maintenance, spoke with Walsh at the motor pool about equipment requisitions, and had a seemingly casual conversation with Corporal Liu about his family back home. Each interaction yielded small but significant pieces of information that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of systematic abuse of power. Liu, normally reserved and professional, opened up after Elena mentioned her concern for soldiers dealing with stress-related health issues. His account of his disciplinary meeting with Hartwick was chilling in its calculated humiliation. Personal questions about his relationship with his parents, suggestions that his loyalty to America might be compromised by his Chinese heritage, implications that his security clearance could be reviewed if questions arose about his reliability. He never said anything directly threatening, Liu explained, his voice barely above a whisper as they stood in the shadow of a supply building. But he made sure I understood that my entire career, my ability to support my family, everything I've worked for could disappear if I didn't demonstrate proper gratitude for his mentorship. Elena recognized the pattern Walsh had identified. Psychological manipulation designed to create dependency and silence resistance. Hartwick was skilled at walking the line between legitimate command authority and personal predation, using institutional power to mask individual crimes. By 1330 hours, Elena had assembled a mental profile of Hartwick's methodology that would have impressed her criminal justice professors. He identified vulnerable targets through their personnel files and informal observation. He isolated them from potential allies through strategic assignments and social manipulation. He established dominance through a combination of rewards and punishments, creating psychological dependency that made victims complicit in their own exploitation. But Elena had also discovered something else. She wasn't alone in her suspicions. Quiet conversations throughout the morning had revealed a network of soldiers who had noticed Hartwick's behavior, documented incidents, and privately discussed concerns. They had been operating in isolation, each believing they were the only ones who saw the pattern, but collectively they represented a significant body of evidence. At 1355 hours, Elena stood outside Colonel Hartwick's office, her service pistol properly secured in its holster, her uniform pressed to regulation standards, her mind calm with the clarity that came from finally understanding the true nature of the conflict she was facing. She knocked 3 times, sharp and precise. Enter. Hartwick's office was a study in military efficiency mixed with personal ambition. The walls displayed his various commendations and photographs with high-ranking officials, while his desk was organized with the obsessive precision of someone who controlled every detail of his environment. The colonel himself sat behind his desk, reviewing what appeared to be personnel files, but Elena noticed that her own file was open on top of the stack. Sergeant Vasquez, right on time. Please, have a seat. Hartwick gestured to the chair positioned directly across from his desk. a setup that placed him in the position of authority while forcing visitors to look up at him. I've been reviewing your service record in detail, and I must say, it's quite impressive. Elena sat down, maintaining proper military posture while keeping her hands relaxed and ready. Thank you, sir. I've always strived to serve with distinction. Yes, I can see that. 3 combat deployments, exemplary marksmanship scores, leadership commendations from your peers. Hartwick closed her file and leaned back in his chair, studying her with the calculating gaze she had learned to recognize. The kind of record that opens doors to significant advancement opportunities. I appreciate the Colonel's confidence in my abilities. Which brings us to the Quantico position I mentioned. Advanced Marksmanship Instructor is a prestigious assignment, the kind that sets soldiers up for commissioning opportunities and senior leadership roles. Hartwick stood and moved around his desk, ostensibly to retrieve another file from his cabinet, but Elena noticed that the movement positioned him closer to her chair, invading her personal space in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. However, he continued, such recommendations require careful consideration of all factors. Technical competence is important, of course, but character assessment is equally critical. The military can't afford to promote individuals whose judgment might be questionable. Elena felt the familiar chill of recognition. This was the moment Hartwick typically applied pressure, using the promise of advancement as leverage to secure compliance and silence. I understand, sir. Character and judgment are fundamental to military leadership, exactly. Which is why I'm concerned about some reports I've been receiving. Nothing official, you understand, just informal observations from various personnel. About certain conversations that have been taking place among some of our soldiers. Hartwick moved behind her chair, a power play designed to make her feel vulnerable and exposed. Elena resisted the urge to turn around, instead keeping her gaze fixed straight ahead while using her peripheral vision to track his movement. I'm not sure I understand what the Colonel is referring to. Gossip, Elena. Speculation. The kind of talk that damages unit cohesion and undermines confidence in command authority. His voice carried a harder edge now, the paternal facade beginning to slip. Talk about imagined grievances, unfounded accusations. The sort of paranoid thinking that sometimes develops when soldiers spend too much time in isolation without proper guidance. Sir, if there are specific concerns about my conduct or judgment, I would appreciate the opportunity to address them directly. Hartwick chuckled, but there was no warmth in the sound. Oh, Elena, there's nothing specific yet. But you know how these things work. Rumors have a way of becoming reality if they're not properly managed. Careers can be destroyed by perception as easily as by fact. Elena felt him move closer, close enough that she could sense his presence directly behind her chair. This was the critical moment, the point where Hartwick typically escalated from psychological pressure to physical intimidation. Her training kicked in automatically: threat assessment, escape route evaluation, weapons inventory. For instance, Hartwick continued, his voice dropping to just above a whisper, I've heard that some soldiers have been documenting alleged incidents, keeping informal records of interactions with superior officers. The kind of behavior that could be interpreted as insubordination, or worse, preparation for false accusations against command personnel. Elena's blood ran cold. He knew about Maria's notebook, Walsh's observations, possibly even her own investigation, which meant their security had been compromised, their conversations monitored or reported. The network of concerned soldiers she had discovered that morning might be walking into a trap. Colonel, I want to assure you that I have nothing but respect for proper chain of command and military protocol. I'm sure you do. But respect is demonstrated through actions, not words. Through loyalty when loyalty is tested. Through discretion when discretion is required. Hartwick placed his hands on the back of her chair, bracketing her shoulders without quite touching her. I need to know that I can count on your discretion, Elena, your loyalty, your understanding of what's truly in your best interests. The threat was now explicit. Submit to his authority, abandon any investigation or resistance, and reap the rewards of compliance. Refuse and face the consequences of opposing someone with the power to destroy careers and lives. Elena took a slow, deep breath, centering herself for what she knew was coming next. Sir, I believe my record speaks to my loyalty and discretion. I've always placed the welfare of my fellow soldiers and the integrity of my unit above personal considerations. Have you? Hartwick's grip tightened on her chair. Because from where I sit, it looks like you've been placing personal relationships and unfounded suspicions above your duty to your commanding officer. With respect, sir, my duty is to the Constitution, the Army, and the soldiers under my protection, not to any individual officer, regardless of rank. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Elena had just explicitly stated that her loyalty had limits, that she would not be bought or intimidated into silence. Hartwick's response was immediate and predictable. His hands moved from her chair to her shoulders, gripping them firmly in a gesture that could be interpreted as either paternal guidance or physical restraint. Elena, I think you're misunderstanding the situation here. Your duty is to follow lawful orders from superior officers. Your welfare, your career, your future, all of that depends on maintaining proper relationships with command authority. Elena remained perfectly still, her voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Colonel, I would appreciate it if you would remove your hands from my person. This conversation can continue without physical contact. Instead of releasing her, Hartwick's grip tightened. I don't think you're listening, Sergeant. I'm trying to help you understand the consequences of poor judgment. The kind of judgment that leads soldiers to believe they can challenge their superiors without facing appropriate discipline. This was it, the moment when Hartwick crossed the line from psychological manipulation to physical intimidation. The moment that would determine whether Elena became another victim of his systematic abuse or the catalyst for his downfall. Sir, you need to remove your hands now. Elena's voice carried the cold authority of someone prepared to enforce her words with action. Or what? Hartwick leaned down, his face close to her ear. You'll file a complaint? We both know how those complaints are handled. You'll threaten me? That would be insubordination, grounds for court-martial. You'll resist? That would be assaulting the superior officer, a federal crime. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena felt his breath against her neck and recognized the moment of truth that had been building for months. Every victim of Hartwick's predation had faced this same choice: submit to his authority and become complicit in their own exploitation, or resist and face the full weight of military justice turned against them. But Elena had spent 12 years learning to make split-second decisions under extreme pressure. And her decision was already made. In one fluid motion, she stood up and spun around, her right hand shooting up to break Hartwick's grip while her left hand secured his wrist in a control hold that immediately reversed their positions of power. Years of combat training and close-quarters battle experience took over, and suddenly the colonel found himself off balance and vulnerable. His arm twisted at an angle that promised immediate pain if he resisted. I said, remove your hands, sir. Elena's voice was ice-cold, professional, the tone of someone who had killed 17 enemies in defense of her country and would not hesitate to defend herself against one more. Hartwick's eyes widened with shock and rage. You're assaulting a superior officer, Sergeant. This is treason. No, sir. This is self-defense against unwanted physical contact after I explicitly requested that you stop. Elena maintained her control hold, keeping Hartwick immobilized without applying enough pressure to cause injury. Military regulations. are quite clear about appropriate physical contact between superior and subordinate personnel. For a moment, they were frozen in tableau, the predatory colonel and the soldier who refused to be his victim, the power dynamic that had defined their relationship suddenly and irrevocably reversed. Hartwick's face cycled through emotions, shock at Elena's resistance, rage at his loss of control, and finally calculation as he realized the implications of what had just happened. Release me immediately, or I'll have you court-martialed for assault. I'll release you when you acknowledge that you understand military regulations regarding appropriate conduct between officers and enlisted personnel. Elena's grip remained firm but controlled. And when you assure me that this conversation will continue in a professional manner. Hartwick's jaw worked furiously, but Elena could see him weighing his options. He could escalate the physical confrontation. But Elena was younger, stronger, and extensively trained in combat techniques. He could call for help, but that would require explaining why he had been physically restraining a subordinate soldier in his private office. He could threaten her with court-martial, but doing so would invite investigation into the circumstances that led to the altercation. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. I understand military regulations regarding professional conduct. Elena released his arm and stepped back, maintaining appropriate distance while keeping herself ready for any renewed aggression. Thank you, sir. I believe we understand each other now. Hartwick rubbed his wrist and returned to his position behind his desk, but his composure was shattered. The careful facade of paternal authority had been replaced by naked hostility. You have no idea what you've just done, Sergeant. No idea of the forces you've set in motion. I have a pretty good idea, sir. I've just demonstrated that I won't be intimidated, manipulated, or abused by anyone, regardless of their rank or position. Elena remained at attention, but her eyes met his without flinching. And I suspect I'm not the only soldier on this base who feels that way. The implication was clear. Elena wasn't acting alone, and Hartwick's reign of intimidation was facing organized resistance. The colonel's face went pale as he processed the meaning of her words. Get out of my office, he said quietly. Yes, sir. Will there be anything else regarding the Quantico recommendation? Hartwick's laugh was bitter and filled with promise of retribution. I think we can safely say that particular opportunity is no longer available to you, Sergeant. Elena nodded, unsurprised. I understand, sir. Permission to return to my duties? Granted, dismissed. Elena saluted with crisp precision and turned to leave, but Hartwick's voice stopped her at the door. Sergeant Vasquez? This isn't over, not by a long shot. Elena looked back over her shoulder, her expression calm despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. No, sir, I don't believe it is. She left the office and walked calmly across the base, maintaining military bearing despite the knowledge that she had just irrevocably altered the trajectory of her military career. There would be consequences for what had happened in Hartwick's office, retribution disguised as military justice, professional retaliation masked as routine personnel decisions. But for the first time in months, Elena felt something she had almost forgotten. The satisfaction of taking a stand for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. She found Marcus and Walsh waiting near the communications center, their faces tense with concern. They had obviously been discussing the situation, probably trying to decide whether to intervene if Elena's meeting with Hartwick went badly. How did it go? Marcus asked. Elena looked at her two closest allies, soldiers who had risked their own careers to support her investigation into Hartwick's predatory behavior, and made a decision that would define the rest of her military service. It went exactly how we expected it would, she said. Hartwick showed his true colors, and I showed him mine. Now the real work begins. Within 24 hours of Elena's confrontation with Colonel Hartwick, the entire dynamic on Forward Operating Base Sentinel had shifted like tectonic plates realigning after an earthquake. Word of the incident spread through the informal networks that connected soldiers more efficiently than any official communication system, and the response was immediate and decisive. Maria Santos arrived at Elena's barracks at 0600 hours. The next morning, her medical bag in one hand and her carefully documented notebook in the other. Her face carried the determined expression of someone who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to see it through to its conclusion. "Elena, I need to examine you for any injuries from yesterday's incident, and I need to document everything for the official record." Maria's voice was professional, but Elena could hear the underlying current of barely controlled anger. "Because as of this morning, we're no longer operating in the shadows." Elena submitted to the medical examination, though she had sustained no injuries during her brief physical confrontation with Hartwick. The documentation was important not for her own protection, but as part of the evidential foundation they would need for what was coming next. "Maria, you need to understand what you're risking here. Once we cross this line, there's no going back. Hartwick will use every resource at his disposal to destroy anyone who threatens him. Elena, I became a medic to protect soldiers. That oath doesn't come with exceptions for when the threat wears the same uniform." Maria finished her examination and began filling out forms with methodical precision. "Besides, you're not the only one who's had enough of his bullshit." As if summoned by her words, Walsh appeared in the doorway, followed by Marcus Corporal Lou, and to Elena's surprise, Captain Rodriguez. The executive officer looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept, and his usually immaculate uniform showed signs of hasty dressing. "Sergeant Vasquez," Rodriguez said formally, "I need to debrief you regarding yesterday's incident in Colonel Hartwick's office." Elena straightened to attention, but Rodriguez waved her to a more relaxed posture. "This is going to be an unusual conversation, Sergeant, so let's dispense with excessive formality." He looked around the small barracks room, taking in the assembled group of soldiers, then seemed to make a decision that visibly aged him. "Last night, I received 3 separate reports about Colonel Hartwick's conduct toward subordinate personnel. This morning, I found 4 more reports waiting on my desk, and my phone has been ringing with calls from soldiers requesting private meetings to discuss command climate issues." Elena felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. Rodriguez's presence suggested that their situation might finally receive official attention, but it also meant they were now operating in uncharted territory where military protocol and personal justice intersected in potentially explosive ways. "Sir, are you saying that formal complaints are being filed?" "I'm saying that the dam has burst, Sergeant. Your confrontation with the Colonel appears to have given other soldiers the courage to come forward with their own experiences. What I'm looking at is a pattern of behavior that can no longer be ignored or handled through unofficial channels." Rodriguez pulled a chair over and sat down, abandoning the traditional military hierarchy for the moment. "But I need to be honest with all of you about what comes next. Filing formal charges against a colonel is not a simple process. It requires extensive investigation, multiple levels of approval, and the kind of bureaucratic review that can take months or years to complete. During that time, everyone involved will be under intense scrutiny." Walsh leaned forward, her expression skeptical. "Sir, with respect, we've all heard promises about official investigations before. What makes this time different?" "What makes this time different," Rodriguez replied, "is that I've spent the last 8 hours on secure communications with the Inspector General's office, the Criminal Investigation Command, and the Office of the Secretary of the Army. This situation has reached a level where it can no longer be contained at the local command level." Elena felt her breath catch. The Inspector General's office was the military's internal watchdog, responsible for investigating allegations of misconduct and abuse of authority. The Criminal Investigation Command handled serious crimes within military jurisdiction. The involvement of the Secretary of the Army's office suggested that word of their situation had reached the highest levels of military leadership. However, Rodriguez continued, I need all of you to understand that this process will be difficult, potentially dangerous, and career-altering for everyone involved. Colonel Hartwick has significant political connections and a reputation for destroying anyone who crosses him. The military justice system, while ultimately fair, is also protective of institutional reputation and resistant to admitting systemic failures. Marcus spoke up for the first time. Sir, what are you advising us to do? I'm advising you to tell the truth, the whole truth, and to be prepared for the consequences of that truth. Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of personal experience. Because once this investigation begins, there will be no middle ground. Either Hartwick will be held accountable for his actions, or all of you will be branded as liars and troublemakers whose military careers are effectively over. Elena understood the magnitude of what Rodriguez was describing. Military culture valued loyalty and hierarchy above almost everything else, and challenging a superior officer was one of the most serious transgressions a soldier could commit. If their allegations against Hartwick were proven false or unprovable, they would face court-martial for insubordination, false official statements, and conspiracy against command authority. But if they remained silent, Hartwick would continue his predatory behavior, destroying the lives and careers of soldiers who depended on the military justice system for protection. Captain Rodriguez, Elena said carefully, can I ask what prompted you to take this step? Why now, after months of looking the other way? Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he spoke, his voice carried the strain of someone confessing a long-held burden. Because 6 months ago, my younger brother reported similar behavior from his commanding officer at Fort Bragg. The complaint disappeared. He was transferred to a dead-end assignment, and he ultimately left the military with a less than honorable discharge that destroyed his plans for using the GI Bill to attend college. Rodriguez's eyes met Elena's. I told myself that his situation was different, that he must have done something to provoke the treatment he received. I convinced myself that good soldiers who followed proper procedures would be protected by the system. The admission hung heavy in the air. Rodriguez had been complicit in Hartwick's predatory behavior, not through active participation, but through willful blindness and institutional loyalty that prioritized organizational reputation over individual justice. Yesterday, when you stood up to Hartwick, you did something I should have done months ago. You put the welfare of soldiers above your own career prospects. You demonstrated the kind of moral courage that the military teaches, but rarely rewards. Rodriguez stood up, his bearing more resolute than Elena had ever seen it. So now I'm asking all of you to continue demonstrating that courage, because the only way this ends is if we're willing to risk everything to do what's right. Over the following week, Forward Operating Base Sentinel became the focal point of one of the most comprehensive military justice investigations in recent memory. Teams of investigators from the Inspector General's Office and Criminal Investigation Command descended on the base, conducting interviews, reviewing personnel files, and documenting a pattern of abuse that extended back years across multiple assignments. Elena found herself at the center of the investigation, providing detailed testimony about her own experiences and observations, while serving as an informal leader for other soldiers, coming forward with their stories. The process was exhausting and emotionally draining, requiring her to relive traumatic experiences while maintaining the professional composure expected of a senior NCO. But something remarkable happened as the investigation progressed. The culture of fear and silence that Hartwick had cultivated began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of solidarity and shared purpose among soldiers who had previously felt isolated and vulnerable. They discovered that Hartwick's predatory behavior was even more extensive than anyone had realized, affecting dozens of soldiers across multiple deployments and assignments. The evidence was overwhelming. Documented medical complaints that correlated with Hartwick's mentorship sessions, personnel actions that showed a clear pattern of retaliation against soldiers who had resisted his advances, financial records indicating that Hartwick had used his position to secure favorable assignments and promotions for soldiers who cooperated with his demands. Most damning of all were the communications intercepts that revealed Hartwick had been in contact with other officers engaged in similar behavior, sharing techniques for manipulation and intimidation while coordinating efforts to protect each other from accountability. 3 weeks after Elena's confrontation with Hartwick, the colonel was arrested by military police and charged with multiple counts of sexual harassment, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming an officer, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The charges carried potential sentences, ranging from dismissal from service to decades in military prison, but the victory came with significant personal costs. Elena's military career, while not destroyed, was fundamentally altered. The Quantico assignment was indeed no longer available, and her prospects for advancement were complicated by her role as a whistleblower in a high-profile case. Some officers viewed her as a hero who had stood up for justice. Others saw her as a troublemaker who had violated the sacred trust between soldiers and their commanders. Maria Santos faced similar challenges, as did Walsh, Marcus, and the other soldiers who had come forward with evidence. They were protected from official retaliation by military regulations and the intense scrutiny surrounding the case, but informal punishment was harder to prevent or prosecute. Yet something unexpected emerged from the wreckage of their military careers, a sense of purpose and moral clarity that transcended traditional measures of professional success. They had proven that the system, however flawed and resistant to change, could ultimately be forced to confront institutional corruption when enough people were willing to risk everything for justice. The investigation also revealed the existence of a broader network of predatory officers operating throughout the military, protected by institutional loyalty and the code of silence that prioritized organizational reputation over individual welfare. Hartwick's arrest was just the beginning of a comprehensive reform effort that would ultimately reshape military culture and justice procedures. 6 months after the initial confrontation, Elena received orders for a new assignment, the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Program at the Pentagon, where she would help develop training protocols and investigative procedures designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had flourished under Hartwick's command. It wasn't the career path she had originally envisioned, but it was meaningful work that directly addressed the problems she had risked everything to expose. More importantly, it was work that honored the courage of soldiers like Morrison, who had paid the ultimate price for speaking truth to power. On her last day at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, Elena stood once again in the armory where her journey toward justice had begun. Her replacement, a young sergeant from Ohio, was going through the same ritual of weapon maintenance that had once provided Elena with solace during her darkest moments. "Sergeant Vasquez?" the young woman asked. "I heard about what happened here, about what you did. I just wanted to say thank you for making it safer for the rest of us." Elena nodded, remembering her own younger self, full of idealism and hope about military service and the protection that institutional structure would provide. "Just remember that your oath is to the Constitution and to your fellow soldiers, not to any individual officer. When those loyalties conflict, the choice should be clear." As Elena packed her personal belongings and prepared for her transfer, she reflected on the price and value of moral courage. She had sacrificed career advancement, financial security, and the comfortable certainty of following orders without question. In return, she had gained something more valuable, the knowledge that she had stood up for what was right when it mattered most. The work was far from over. Military culture would not change overnight, and there would always be those who sought to exploit positions of authority for personal gain. But Elena and her fellow soldiers had proven that resistance was possible. that institutional corruption could be challenged and defeated when enough people were willing to risk everything for justice. As she prepared to leave Forward Operating Base Sentinel for the final time, Elena carried with her the memory of Morrison's young face, the gratitude of soldiers who would never again face Hartwick's predatory behavior, and the hard-won knowledge that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against the corruption that can flourish within one's own ranks. 2 years later, the Pentagon's corridors buzzed with the quiet efficiency of military bureaucracy, but Elena's office in the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Program felt more like a war room than an administrative space. Charts covered the walls showing statistical trends in reporting rates, conviction percentages, and cultural assessment metrics. Her desk was perpetually covered with case files, policy drafts, and correspondence from military installations around the world where similar patterns of abuse had been identified and addressed. Elena had been promoted to staff sergeant, an advancement that came not despite her role as a whistleblower, but because of it. The military's leadership, finally forced to confront the systemic nature of sexual harassment and abuse within its ranks, had discovered that soldiers with personal experience in these issues were invaluable assets in developing effective prevention and response protocols. A knock on her door interrupted her review of a particularly troubling case from a Marine base in California. "Come in." The visitor was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, Marcus's older sister, who had used her brother's experiences to fuel her own rise through the military's legal services branch. She carried a thick folder and wore the satisfied expression of someone bearing good news. "Elena, I thought you'd want to see this personally." Sarah handed over the folder. "Hartwick's final sentencing came through this morning." Elena opened the folder and read through the court-martial proceedings summary. Colonel James Hartwick had been sentenced to 15 years in military prison, dismissal from service, and forfeiture of all pay and benefits. The charges had expanded during the investigation to include not just his behavior at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, but a pattern of abuse spanning his entire career and involving more than 40 victims across multiple installations. 15 years, Elena said quietly. "It's not enough for what he did to all those soldiers, but it's something. It's precedent," Sarah replied. "The military has never pursued a case this aggressively or sentenced a senior officer this harshly for this type of misconduct. Every predator in uniform now knows that institutional protection has limits." Elena set down the folder and looked out her office window toward the Pentagon's central courtyard, where young soldiers and officers moved purposefully between meetings and briefings. Many of them were probably dealing with their own versions of the challenges she had faced 2 years earlier, the moral complexities of military service, the tension between loyalty and justice, the difficulty of speaking truth to power when power held absolute authority over their lives and careers. "Sarah, do you ever wonder if we're making a real difference, or if we're just treating symptoms of a deeper cultural problem?" "Every day. But then I think about soldiers like your friend Morrison, and all the ones whose names we'll never know because they didn't survive long enough to tell their stories." Sarah sat down across from Elena's desk. "The culture change is slow, but it's real. Reporting rates are up 300% over the past 2 years. Conviction rates have doubled. Command climate surveys show measurable improvements in trust and morale." Elena nodded, but she knew the statistics only told part of the story. Real change happened in individual moments, when a young soldier found the courage to report inappropriate behavior, when a commander took allegations seriously instead of dismissing them, when bystanders intervened instead of looking the other way. "Speaking of making a difference," Sarah continued, "I have a proposition for you. How would you feel about taking on a special assignment?" Elena raised an eyebrow. "What kind of special assignment?" "Training and consulting. There's a joint task force being established to work with military installations worldwide that are dealing with similar issues. They want someone with your experience and credibility to help implement the new protocols we've developed here. The offer was tempting. It would mean travel, new challenges, and the opportunity to directly impact military culture on a global scale. But it would also mean leaving behind the routine she had established at the Pentagon, the relationships she had built with colleagues and survivors, the sense of stability that had taken 2 years to achieve. "I'll need to think about it," Elena said. "How long do I have to decide?" "Take all the time you need. The position doesn't officially exist yet. They're still working out funding and organizational structure. But when it's ready, you're their first choice." After Sarah left, Elena returned to her case files, but her mind kept drifting to the Koftiska. Larger questions about justice, institutional change, and personal responsibility that had driven her actions 2 years earlier. She thought about Marcus, now working as a civilian contractor for a military communications company, using his technical skills without the stress of navigating military hierarchy. He had married his college girlfriend and was expecting his first child, building a life that honored his service while acknowledging its limitations. She thought about Walsh, who had taken early retirement and was now running a veterans services organization in Montana, helping former soldiers transition to civilian careers while processing their military experiences. Walsh had found her calling in advocacy work, using her natural protective instincts to shield vulnerable veterans from institutional indifference. She thought about Maria Santos, who had completed her military service and was now in medical school, pursuing her dream of becoming a psychiatrist specializing in trauma treatment for military personnel. Maria's notebook had become evidence in more than a dozen military justice cases, its careful documentation helping to establish the credibility needed to overcome institutional resistance to prosecution. Most often, she thought about Morrison. The young soldier's transfer to Helmand Province had indeed proved fatal. He had been killed by an improvised explosive device just 3 weeks after leaving Forward Operating Base Sentinel. His death had galvanized the investigation into Hartwick's behavior, providing the emotional impetus needed to overcome bureaucratic inertia and command resistance. Morrison's parents had attended Hartwick's sentencing, where they delivered victim impact statements that reduced seasoned military prosecutors to tears. They had also established a foundation dedicated to supporting military personnel who reported sexual harassment and abuse, ensuring that future whistleblowers would have resources and legal support that hadn't been available to their son. Elena's phone rang, interrupting her reflections. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. "Sergeant Vasquez? This is Private First Class Jennifer Martinez. I'm stationed at Fort Carson, and I need your help." Elena felt the familiar chill of recognition. Another soldier, another situation, another test of whether the systems they had fought to establish were actually working to protect vulnerable personnel. "Private Martinez, what's your situation?" "It's my company commander, man, Captain Williams. He's been doing things, saying things, making it clear that my evaluations and assignments depend on how cooperative I am with his mentorship." Martinez's voice carried the same mixture of fear, anger, and desperation that Elena remembered from her own darkest moments at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. "Martinez, I want you to know that you're not alone and you have options. Tell me exactly what's been happening, and we'll figure out the best way to address it." For the next 45 minutes, Elena listened as Martinez described a pattern of behavior that was depressingly familiar. The gradual escalation from inappropriate comments to explicit propositions, the use of military authority to isolate and manipulate, the implied threats of career destruction for non-compliance. But there were also differences that spoke to the progress that had been made. Martinez had documented each incident, following protocols that didn't exist when Elena was dealing with Hartwick. She had consulted with a victim advocate who provided guidance on preservation of evidence and navigation of military justice procedures. Most importantly, she had reached out for help before the situation escalated to physical confrontation or psychological breakdown. Martinez, based on what you've told me, you have a strong case for formal charges. The documentation you've gathered, combined with the patterns you've described, should be more than sufficient to trigger a serious investigation. Elena pulled up Martinez's installation information on her computer, checking the contact details for local support services. But I want to make sure you understand what you're facing if you decide to pursue formal action. Ma'am, I understand. It won't be easy. But I keep thinking about all the other soldiers who might go through this if Captain Williams isn't stopped. I don't want anyone else to feel the way I've been feeling. Elena smiled, recognizing her own motivations from 2 years earlier. Martinez, you have the right instincts and the right documentation. I'm going to connect you with some people who can provide on-site support and guidance. But I also want you to know that what you're doing takes real courage, and regardless of how this turns out, you should be proud of taking a stand. After providing Martinez with contact information for the Installation Inspector General, the Staff Judge Advocate's office, and the local Sexual Assault Response Coordinator, Elena hung up the phone and reflected on how much had changed since her own confrontation with institutional predation. The systems were imperfect, still vulnerable to manipulation and corruption by those who understood how to exploit them, but they were functional in ways that hadn't been true 2 years earlier. Soldiers like Martinez had resources, advocates, and established procedures that provided real protection and meaningful recourse. 5 years later, Elena stood at the podium in the main auditorium at the Army War College, looking out at an audience of senior officers, policymakers, and academic researchers who had gathered for the annual symposium on military ethics and leadership. Her presentation was titled Institutional Accountability and Individual Courage, Lessons from the Hartwick Case, and it represented the culmination of 5 years' worth of research, policy development, and practical implementation of military justice reform. The special assignment Sarah had offered her had evolved into a permanent position as Director of Military Justice Innovation, a role that allowed her to travel extensively while maintaining a base of operations at the Pentagon. She had worked with installations on 6 continents, helping to identify and address patterns of abuse while training commanders and soldiers in recognition, prevention, and response protocols. Ladies and gentlemen, Elena began, 5 years ago, I was a sergeant first class who believed that the military justice system was fundamentally sound, that good soldiers who followed proper procedures would be protected, and that institutional corruption was an aberration rather than a systemic problem. I was wrong on all 3 counts. A murmur went through the audience. Elena's reputation as a reformer was well established, but her willingness to directly challenge military orthodoxy in such a formal setting still surprised some of the more traditional officers in attendance. What I learned through direct experience is that institutional corruption thrives not because of the actions of individual bad actors, but because of the silence and complicity of good people who choose institutional loyalty over moral courage. The Hartwick case wasn't solved by the system working as designed. It was solved by soldiers who were willing to risk everything to force the system to confront its own failures. Elena clicked to her first slide, which showed statistics on military sexual assault reporting and conviction rates over the past decade. The trend lines were clear: dramatic increases in reporting, significant improvements in conviction rates, and measurable changes in command climate assessments. These numbers represent more than policy success. They represent cultural transformation. But that transformation didn't happen through top-down directives or bureaucratic reform. It happened because individual soldiers found the courage to speak truth to power, even when that power held absolute authority over their lives and careers. The presentation continued for 45 minutes, detailing the specific policy changes that had emerged from the Hartwick investigation, the expanded training protocols now required for all military personnel, and the enhanced protections for whistleblowers and victims that had been codified in military law. But Elena's focus wasn't on the bureaucratic victories. It was on the human stories that demonstrated the real impact of institutional change. She talked about Martinez, who had successfully prosecuted her company commander and was now a captain herself, leading sexual assault prevention programs at her own installation. She discussed the network of veteran advocates who used their own experiences to support other survivors. She highlighted the commanders who had embraced transparency and accountability as leadership principles rather than threats to military order. During the question and answer session, a Navy captain raised his hand. "Director Vasquez, your presentation focuses heavily on individual courage and moral leadership. But some critics argue that your approach undermines military discipline and hierarchy. How do you respond to concerns that encouraging soldiers to challenge authority creates operational risks?" Elena had fielded this question dozens of times over the past 5 years, and her response had been refined through practice and reflection. "Captain, military discipline exists to protect soldiers and accomplish missions. When authority is used to harm soldiers rather than protect them, it becomes the antithesis of military discipline. True leadership, the kind that accomplishes difficult missions under dangerous conditions, requires trust between commanders and subordinates. That trust is impossible when soldiers fear that their own leadership poses a greater threat than the enemy." She paused, looking directly at the captain who had asked the question. "As for operational risks, I would argue that the greatest operational risk we face is allowing predators and abusers to remain in positions of authority, where they can destroy unit cohesion, undermine morale, and drive good soldiers out of service. The Hartwick case demonstrated that institutional protection of bad actors ultimately threatens military effectiveness far more than accountability measures." After the presentation, Elena was approached by a young lieutenant colonel who introduced herself as Dr. Rebecca Torres, no relation to the specialist Torres from Forward Operating Base Sentinel, but someone whose career had been shaped by the reforms that case had generated. "Director Vasquez, I wanted to thank you personally. 3 years ago, I was a major dealing with a situation very similar to what you faced with Colonel Hartwick. But because of the protocols you helped develop, the resources you helped establish, I had options that didn't exist when you were going through your ordeal." Elena felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and sadness that came with these conversations. Satisfaction that the systems were working, that soldiers were being protected in ways that hadn't been possible before. Sadness that such protection was necessary, that predators continued to find their way into positions of military authority. "Dr. Torres, can I ask what happened in your situation?" "Complete accountability. My commander was court-martialed, dismissed from service, and sentenced to 8 years in prison. The investigation uncovered a pattern involving 6 other victims. More importantly, the command climate at our installation improved dramatically once it became clear that such behavior would not be tolerated." Torres paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I also wanted to tell you something that might not be in any official reports. After the investigation was complete, I received a letter from the commander's wife. She thanked me for coming forward, said that her husband's behavior at home had become increasingly abusive and that his arrest probably saved her life." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. The ripple effects of institutional corruption extended far beyond military installations, affecting families and communities in ways that were rarely documented or discussed. The courage required to challenge authority wasn't just about protecting fellow soldiers. It was about protecting everyone who might be victimized by unchecked power. 10 years later, Elena's ranch in the hills outside San Antonio was a far cry from the military installations where she had spent most of her adult life. The 150-acre property was home to rescue horses, a large vegetable garden, and a small but thriving nonprofit organization called the Warrior Advocacy Network. The organization provided legal, financial, and emotional support for military personnel, reporting misconduct, filling gaps in official support systems while advocating for continued reform. At 45, Elena had retired from active duty with the rank of Sergeant Major, the highest enlisted rank in the Army. Her military career had been unconventional, marked more by her contributions to institutional reform than traditional measures of military success. But she had found purpose in work that directly addressed the problems she had risked everything to expose. The ranch also served as a retreat center for military survivors of sexual assault and harassment, providing a safe space for healing and recovery away from the institutional environments where their trauma had occurred. Elena had discovered that horses were particularly effective therapy partners for veterans dealing with trust issues and hypervigilance. The animals' sensitivity to human emotion and their requirement for authentic, honest interaction created opportunities for healing that traditional therapy sometimes couldn't achieve. On this particular morning, Elena was working with a young Marine corporal named David Kim, who had reported sexual assault by his squad leader and was struggling with the aftermath of both the original trauma and the military justice process. Kim was leading a gentle mare named Esperanza through a series of ground exercises designed to build confidence and trust. "She's not listening to me," Kim said, frustration evident in his voice as the horse failed to respond to his direction. "What do you think might be causing that?" Elena asked, watching the interaction from a safe distance. "I don't know. I'm doing everything you taught me." "David, look at your body language. How are you holding yourself? What is Esperanza seeing when she looks at you?" Kim paused and examined his own posture. His shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched, his hands rigid on the lead rope. I'm scared. Of Esperanza? No, of failing. Of not being good enough. Of proving that everyone who said I couldn't handle military life was right." Kim's voice cracked slightly. "I used to be confident. I used to believe I could do anything if I worked hard enough, but after what happened, I don't trust my own judgment anymore." Elena approached slowly, keeping her movements calm and purposeful. "David, what happened to you wasn't about your judgment or your capabilities. It was about someone else's criminal behavior. The fact that you reported it, that you're fighting for justice despite the personal cost, that takes more courage than anything you ever did in combat. But my career is over. My family doesn't understand why I couldn't just handle it quietly. My friends from basic training avoid me because they're afraid of guilt by association." Kim's shoulders sagged. "I did the right thing, but it feels like I'm being punished for it." Elena handed Kim a carrot to offer Esperanza, then guided him through a breathing exercise designed to calm both human and horse. "David, I want to tell you something that nobody told me when I was going through my own situation. The price of doing what's right is often higher than the price of staying silent. But the value of doing what's right extends far beyond your own life." As Kim relaxed, Esperanza began responding to his cues, following his gentle guidance through the training exercise. The change was immediate and dramatic. The horse seemed to recognize something authentic in Kim's demeanor that hadn't been present before. "You see that?" Elena pointed to the interaction between Kim and Esperanza. "She's responding to your authentic self, not the person you think you're supposed to be. That's what courage looks like, not the absence of fear, but authenticity in the face of fear." Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus, now a successful civilian contractor living in Colorado with his wife and 3 children. The message included a photo of his oldest daughter, 8-year-old Elena Vasquez Chun, wearing a junior ROTC uniform at her elementary school's career day. "She insisted on wearing this," Marcus had written. When her teacher asked why, she said she wanted to be like Aunt Elena, someone who protects people and does the right thing even when it's hard. Elena smiled at the photo, thinking about the legacy of courage that passed from one generation to the next. The children who grew up hearing stories about standing up to bullies, speaking truth to power, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves would become the leaders who shape future institutional culture. "David," she said, turning back. "To the young Marine, I want you to understand something important. Your decision to report what happened to you has already protected other Marines from experiencing the same trauma. The investigation triggered by your complaint uncovered a pattern of behavior that affected multiple victims. Your courage saved people you'll never meet." Kim nodded, tears streaming down his face as he continued working with Esperanza. "It doesn't feel like enough. It never does. But it's everything." 15 years later, the Military Justice Reform Institute occupied a modern building in downtown Washington, D.C., its glass walls offering views of both the Capitol building and the Pentagon. Elena served as the Institute's executive director, overseeing research, policy development, and advocacy efforts that had fundamentally transformed military culture over the past decade and a half. The Institute's work extended far beyond sexual assault prevention. They addressed military justice reform comprehensively, examining everything from racial disparities in military discipline to the treatment of LGBTQ+ service members to the protection of religious minorities within military culture. But the methodological approach remained consistent with the principles Elena had learned during her confrontation with Hartwick. Institutional change required both systemic reform and individual courage. On this particular afternoon, Elena was meeting with a delegation of international military officials who were studying American military justice reforms for potential implementation in their own countries. The group included representatives from Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, Germany, and South Korea, all nations grappling with similar challenges in military culture and institutional accountability. "Director Vasquez," said Colonel Margaret Thompson from the British Army, "your reforms have been impressive, but they've also been expensive and disruptive. How do you maintain military readiness while implementing such comprehensive cultural change?" Elena had anticipated this question. It was the eternal tension between institutional stability and moral progress, the fear that accountability measures would somehow undermine military effectiveness. "Colonel Thompson, I would argue that military readiness depends fundamentally on trust between soldiers and their leaders, trust between units operating in dangerous conditions, trust between military institutions and the civilian populations they serve. When that trust is compromised by institutional corruption, military effectiveness suffers far more than it does from accountability measures." She clicked to a slide showing deployment statistics over the past 15 years. Since implementation of comprehensive military justice reforms, we've seen measurable improvements in unit cohesion, retention rates, recruitment success, and mission effectiveness. The correlation is clear. When soldiers trust their institutions, they perform better. The German representative, General Klaus Weber, raised his hand. "But how do you balance institutional loyalty with individual conscience?" Military effectiveness requires soldiers to follow orders, even orders they might personally disagree with. General Weber, that's exactly the right question, and it goes to the heart of military ethics. We teach soldiers to follow lawful orders from legitimate authority. When authority becomes illegitimate, when commanders abuse their position to harm rather than protect soldiers, following those orders becomes a violation of military duty rather than an expression of it. Elena paused, looking around the room at the assembled officers. The Hartwick case taught us that blind obedience to authority is not military discipline. It's abdication of moral responsibility. True military discipline requires soldiers to understand the difference between legitimate command authority and predatory abuse of power. After the meeting, Elena walked through downtown Washington toward her apartment, reflecting on how far military culture had evolved since her days as a sniper at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The changes were measurable and significant, reporting Rates for sexual harassment and assault had increased by more than 400%, while conviction rates had improved by over 300%. Command climate surveys showed dramatic improvements in trust, morale, and unit cohesion. Most importantly, the culture of silence and institutional protection for predators had been replaced by a culture of transparency and accountability. But Elena knew that institutional change was never permanent, that each generation of military leaders had to actively choose between moral courage and institutional convenience. The systems they had built could be dismantled by leaders who prioritized organizational reputation over individual welfare. The progress they had achieved could be reversed by a return to the old patterns of silence and complicity. As she reached her apartment building, Elena's phone rang. The caller ID showed a name she hadn't seen in years: Jennifer Martinez, the young soldier who had called her for help during her early years at the Pentagon. "Elena, this is Jen Martinez." "Well, Lieutenant, Colonel Martinez now. I hope you remember me." Elena smiled, remembering the frightened young private who had reached out for help 15 years earlier. "Of course I remember you, Jen. How are you doing?" "I'm doing well, really well. I wanted to call because I just received orders for my next assignment. They're giving me command of the 82nd Airborne's Military Justice Division. I'll be responsible for implementing sexual assault prevention programs for the entire division." Elena felt a surge of pride and hope. Martinez represented the future of military leadership officers who had personally experienced the importance of institutional accountability and would never tolerate the return of predatory command climates. "That's wonderful news, Jin. You'll be able to make a real difference in soldiers' lives." "Elena, I also wanted to tell you something. Last week, a young soldier in my current unit came to me with a situation very similar to what I went through 15 years ago. But this time, the system worked exactly as it was supposed to. The investigation was swift, thorough, and professional. The perpetrator was held accountable. The victim received comprehensive support. The unit's morale actually improved because everyone saw that predatory behavior would not be tolerated." Martinez paused, and Elena could hear the emotion in her voice. "What you did, what all of you did back then, it made that possible. That young soldier will never know your name, but she benefited directly from your courage." After ending the call, Elena stood on her apartment balcony, looking out over the Washington, D.C. skyline toward the Pentagon building where her transformation from soldier to advocate had begun. The city lights twinkled like stars, each one representing lives and stories and struggles that connected to the larger human project of building institutions worthy of the people who served them. She thought about Morrison, whose death had galvanized the investigation that changed everything. She thought about Marcus, now a grandfather whose children were growing up in a world where military service was safer and more just than it had been a generation earlier. She thought about Walsh, Maria, Rodriguez, and all the others who had risked their careers to ensure that institutional corruption would not go unchallenged. Most of all, she thought about the young soldiers currently serving around the world, the ones who would never experience the kind of predatory abuse that had once flourished in military culture because previous generations had been willing to sacrifice everything to create better systems of protection and accountability. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to demonstrate moral courage, new choices between institutional convenience and individual justice. But tonight, Elena Vasquez stood on her balcony and allowed herself to feel something she had rarely experienced during her darkest moments at Forward Operating Base Sentinel: the satisfaction of work that had mattered, courage that had counted, and a legacy that would protect soldiers for generations to come. The woman who had once cleaned her sniper rifle in a lonely armory, wondering if anyone would stand up to institutional corruption, had become part of the solution she had once desperately needed. The rifle was retired now, locked in a display case in her apartment alongside her military decorations and commendations. But the principles that had guided her use of that weapon, protection of the innocent, defense against threats, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, continued to guide her work in the ongoing battle for military justice and institutional accountability. As Elena prepared for bed, she reflected on her grandmother's words from so many years ago. Eventually, the people stopped being afraid. The fear hadn't disappeared entirely. Institutional change was always fragile, always vulnerable to regression and complacency. But Elena had helped build systems and culture that made courage more possible, accountability more likely, and justice more accessible for soldiers who found themselves facing the kind of moral crisis she had confronted 15 years earlier. In military installations around the world, young soldiers were sleeping safely tonight because previous generations had been willing to risk everything to ensure their protection. That legacy of courage would continue as long as people were willing to choose moral conviction over personal comfort, justice over institutional loyalty, and the protection of the vulnerable over the convenience of the powerful. The work continued. The mission endured. And somewhere in the darkness, another soldier was finding the courage to stand up for what was right, inspired by the knowledge that others had walked this path before and survived to tell the story. If Elena Vasquez's journey of courage and justice resonated with you, there are many more compelling stories waiting to be discovered. Hit that subscribe button to join our community of listeners who believe that powerful storytelling can inspire real change. Every week, we bring you gripping tales of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, stories of courage, resilience, and the triumph of human spirit over adversity. What you'll get when you subscribe: weekly episodes featuring unforgettable characters and moral dilemmas, behind the scenes, insights into story development and research, early access to special episodes, and bonus content. A community of engaged listeners who discuss and share these meaningful narratives. Don't miss out on stories that matter. Stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of our shared humanity. Subscribe now and ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode that could change how you see the world. Your next favorite story is just one click away.